Welcome. I'm Terry Cook, CEO of the Hamilton Community Foundation. It's my pleasure to welcome you here on behalf of Hamilton's Basic Income Group, the Hamilton Roundtable for Poverty Reduction, and from our Hamilton Community Foundation. This is going to be a fascinating evening in that we have one of Canada's most distinguished citizens and a passionate advocate for the Universal Basic Income program with us. He will be suitably introduced in a couple of minutes, but I've had the good fortune to spend some time with you today, and it has been a full Hamilton day, and we've had a great engagement with this community. I do want to acknowledge that we have a couple of elected officials with us tonight. I know Philomena Tassi is hoping to join us. My friend, the mayor, is here. My sweetheart, the councillor from Ward 1, is here. I still have a crush on her. And my friend Ted McMeekin, a former Liberal cabinet minister, mayor of Flamborough, and a colleague of mine and a great advocate for basic income, is with us as well. So thank you all for joining us, and thank all of you for your interest in this subject matter. At the top of the agenda, I would like to invite Rhonda Costello, who has been a basic income participant and a very avid volunteer with the Roundtable on Poverty, to come and provide a land acknowledgement to start the evening's program. Rhonda, please.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Rhonda Costello. I would like to begin by acknowledging that the land on which we gather is the traditional territory of the Erie, Neutral, Huron, Wendat, Anishinaabe, and the Haudenosaunee Nation, and currently the home to many indigenous people from across the total land within the lands protected by the dish with one spoon, one palm agreement. Let us strive to rise above where words and seek to inspire action and continue towards recognizing and furthering our relationship with the land and the indigenous people. Let us be the reminder of the teaching of the dish with one spoon, one palm agreement. Only take what you need. Always leave something in the dish for everyone else. Include the dish and keep the dish clean. Be more than words. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Rhonda. It's now my pleasure to call upon Jody Dean. And for those of you who have not met or heard from Jody, she is a powerful voice for people with lived experience, a sole support parent to 3 children, 2 of whom are special needs, who's back at school, upgrading her skills, and also serving as a tireless volunteer and advocate for people trying to navigate an often difficult bureaucratic system. And she's been good enough to come and share with us some of her life experience tonight to set the context for our discussion with you. Jody.
Thank you. Thank you for listening to my story tonight, everybody. This is about my personal struggles in poverty. I was a single mom to 3 amazing kids for many years. As you said, 2 of them with special needs. I've been married to my childhood sweetheart for over 20 years. We lived a comfortable middle-class life. We were able to choose for me to be a stay-at-home mom. Unfortunately, after a divorce, I found it next to impossible to find work after being home for so long, despite the fact that I had already a college education. I had a special needs daughter who requires a lot of my time. I decided to go back to school part-time to try and get a degree in social work, and I've been working on that degree ever since. It's been about 8 years, and I'm still at my final stretch. In the time after my divorce, my family and I lived in deep poverty. We survived day to day, sometimes meal to meal. I got stuck in the red tape that meant that I didn't qualify for Ontario Works, because I had a court order that said that I was going to be receiving support from my ex-husband. In the midst of all of this, I got cut off from my child tax credit, which was my only guaranteed income at the time. I got cut off because I couldn't prove that my husband of 20 years didn't live in my home. And I had to jump through those hoops while trying to hide the foreclosure signs on our home from our children when I came home from picking them up after school. I lost my home eventually. We had to sell. I sold most of my belongings to make sure that my kids had food on the table and a roof over their head. I only survived because of the amazing personal support that I had. Without them, I don't know where my family and I would be today. I was able to get back on my feet, but I couldn't afford the new shoes. Since then, I have recently remarried, and we were part of the working poor. My youngest daughter is now 12, and she has special needs. She has a rare condition called osteogenesis imperfecta and epilepsy. She has many appointments here in Hamilton, Sick Kids Toronto, and we have to leave every few months to go to Montreal Shriners, where she gets specialized treatment for her condition. On any given day, I can be called to pick her up from school because she's had a seizure or she's broke a bone. These are things that are daily in our lives. For me to go back to work now is impossible. As an example, last year she missed 99 days of school. There was a night many years ago, before I remarried, that I want to share with you because it's one of those mom moments that stick in your memory forever. She had broken her leg, and I needed to take her up to McMaster to x-ray and to get a cast put on. But I didn't have money for parking. Now, I'm a single mom. I had a vehicle. I couldn't park the car and walk back with her. I couldn't leave her alone at 8 years old at the hospital and go park the car and come back. What do? I parked it underground and I hoped for the best. And while I should have been focusing all my attention on my little girl who was broken, I spent as much time as I could texting everybody I know and asking them, hey, these guys got 20 bucks you can bring down to me so I can get my car out to get her home at the end of the day. I was ashamed and I was humiliated that something as simple as parking was something that I couldn't afford. I honestly don't know what I would have done had I not had family to come and help me out. And I'm not relaying this message to elicit sympathy, but instead I want to share to you how income security and how the basic income changed our lives. When I was selected as a participant in the basic income pilot, the very first thing I did every single month was buy parking passes so that I would never ever be left in that predicament with her again. Basic income has given me the security that I needed to relieve some of the stresses of our everyday life. Now, during the time that we received basic income, my husband was injured and incurred some medical issues. He'd been off work, and we lost all of his income instantly. The wait for him to return to work was one that was almost crippling for us financially. Basic income kept us afloat while we were receiving it. When he finally went back to work a year after the pilot had ended, and we're still just barely crawling out of the hole that we were in because of the loss of income. I'm constantly worried about my children, and adding the stress of money sometimes makes you feel like you're completely broken, and it drains all of your energy. As an example, I sit night after night trying to figure out what more I can cut from our daily living to make ends meet at the end of the day. One day when my daughter is older and more independent, I will be able to go back to work and give back, but for now, it's not in the near future. Since the pilot was abruptly ended, my husband's income was on hold, we had to stop all of my daughter's over-the-counter medications because I simply could not afford to buy them anymore. There are simple things that people take for granted we were not able to do, we were on basic income. Things like stopping after she's worked out at physiotherapy for a hard session and buying her a smoothie on the way out the door. Those simple things that make her very happy, we just couldn't do without the basic income. I was very thankful. I hope that you will be able to see the difference that basic income makes to a family like mine, because we're not alone. There are many other hard-working families that just are devastated by one quick change of loss of job, injury, or illness. In a blink of an eye, you lose everything. Basic income changes lives. Many people's, it saves them. It saves you from devastating poverty, possible homelessness, mental and physical health issues. These are all the things that come along with living in poverty. Thank you very much for listening to a bit of my story. I hope that you guys have been able to take something in from it.
Thank you for the courage of sharing your story and grounding our discussion tonight in humanity. Thanks so much. It's now my pleasure to ask Joey Coleman to introduce our guest speaker. Joey, for many of you, will know he's a local crowdfunded independent journalist. He's now the Southam Fellow at Massey College, where our guest speaker was the principal until recently. When he was a teenage beat reporter, he used to torment me at City Hall, so I like the fact that he's tormenting Fred and others better than when he used to do it to me personally. And Joey, I would ask you to come forward and do us the honor of introducing our special guest.
Thank you for the warm welcome. It's nice to be in Hamilton this evening, and I look forward to not having to say it's nice to be in Hamilton and just being back in Hamilton. Hugh Segal is somebody I greatly admire. It's amazing to live at Massey and each day know and see the impact of his work there. He has had a storied career in public service. Born in Montreal to the parents of Russian immigrants, Hugh Segal was educated in Ottawa and was very active in student politics, including as president of the University of Ottawa's student body in the early 1970s. He volunteered on John Diefenbaker's campaigns, worked for MP David MacDonald, former Conservative leader Robert Stanfield, was principal secretary to former Ontario Premier Bill Davis, and in the early 1990s was chief of staff to Canada's 18th Prime Minister Brian Mulroney. In these roles, he was involved in some of the most influential decisions of the day, including the patriation of the Constitution in the early 1980s and later in free trade negotiations. He then went on to serve many years in the Senate of Canada, where he was deputy chair of the Standing Senate Committee on Social Affairs, Science and Technology, and co-wrote a sentimental report, In From the Margins, that took a critical look at poverty in Canada and made some bold recommendations. One of those ideas was basic income. Hugh Segal has been a basic income advocate for over 50 years now, having first been intrigued by the idea at a conference in the late 1960s. In 2016, he was asked by then Premier Kathleen Wynne to develop a framework for the basic income pilot. Many of us in this room are connected to Hugh because of this pilot and his work in this area. But many of you may not know that Hugh has two dogs, Farley and Ernie. I learned this very quickly upon moving into Massey College. The graduate students talk about the dogs all the time. I assure you, Hugh, I'm pretty sure they miss you as well. Today, we welcome Hugh to Hamilton, which was one of the 3 cities where we tested the idea of basic income. We are joined by many individuals who took part in this short-lived but bold pilot. We owe a debt of gratitude to all of those involved in the pilot and all that are committed to building a better and more just Canada. Without further ado, welcome Hugh Segal to share with us how we build that better Canada.
Okay, let's check the volume. Quick
Hello?
sound check.
Can you hear me back there? Can you hear me? Good, great, thank you.
Well, thank you so much for being with us.
Great to be here.
This is our second iteration today because you did my TV show earlier.
I did.
And I was saying to you over dinner that was the softball easy part of the agenda. You're now going to meet some real Hamiltonians and they may rough you up a little bit. But allow me a fanboy moment here because like you, I was raised as a red Tory, an endangered species in this country these days.
That's correct.
And we shared earlier today that you and I were in common influence by 3 great Hamilton political leaders. Mm-hmm. The youngest ever member of the House of Commons who became a mentor to me, Sean O'Sullivan, God rest his soul. Canada's first female cabinet minister, who you talk about in your book, Ellen Fairclough.
Indeed.
And of course, our greatest citizen, Link Alexander. I just want to say that you, sir, are somebody that rank with Link and Ellen and Sean in my books, and I hold you in the highest regard, and we're honored to have you here, and I'm tickled to be able to interview you tonight.
Is he given to
But-
overstatement all the time?
Right. The gospel.
It's a pleasure to be here. It really is. And for me, Hamilton has always been a place where people have done difficult things with courage and determination. Ellen did that for our immigration system and changed it radically. So all around the world, from Boris Johnson to Mr. Trump and others, to say we want the Canadian immigration system based on points. And that was Ellen Fairclough who did that and put that together as the first cabinet minister, female cabinet minister in the history of the federal government of Canada.
And in the Commonwealth.
Well, that's right. And Lincoln, of course, broke through a series of barriers and may have been the most courageous and determined advocate for fairness and decency and for the handicapped when he was our vice-regal representative. And he was this person who not only stood almost 7 feet tall, but he seemed 10 feet tall when you heard him speak. He was a very compelling individual.
Indeed. So let's start with your story, because in your fabulous book, Bootstraps Need Boots, A Lonely Tory's Fight to End Poverty in Canada, you talk about growing up on the cheery edge of poverty in Montreal, and there's a story I'm going to put you on the spot to tell about your father giving away your toy box and how you responded to that experience.
Well, the title, Bootstraps Need Boots, comes from a quotation that I cited from the Reverend Martin Luther King, who said when he was campaigning on a whole series of fundamental civil rights laws and issues, he said, telling people to pull themselves up by their own bootstraps only makes sense if they have boots. If they don't have boots, it's just cruel, mischievous, and unfair. So that's where the title came from. And it is very reminiscent of, I was about 8 years old, and I had a great old mahogany toy box that was also a place that you could hang coat things, and there was a big drawer, and in it, I mean, we're talking the late 1950s or so, the mid 1950s, so you had your Slinky toys and your Bolo bats and your Canadians hockey hats, and a whole bunch of other things that constituted, it's kind of like a CPU is today for a young person, their own computer and their own, etc. But it was the center of my life. And I came home from school one day, and all my toys were neatly packaged in paper bags along the wall, and it was gone. So I said to my brother, Brian, who was home from high school, and I wandered down to his bedroom, and I said, so, where's the toy box? He said, I don't know. Better ask your dad. Well, my dad was unemployed. My dad ended up being a cab driver. He'd been unemployed for quite a long period of time. My mother was an all-night cashier at the Medical Arts Pharmacy down on Sherbrooke and Guy Avenue in Montreal, bring a little bit of cash into the family. And they were two really wonderful, loving parents. But it was clear that, when the congregation sent a food basket over to our house and various other of those initiatives, that we were on the cheery edge of poverty. There was always heat in the house. I remember on Sunday nights, there would be a pile of bills. This was before universal health insurance, by the way. So there'd be the doctor's bills and the pharmacist's bills and the butcher's bills and the grocery bills, and of course the bill from the oil company with which we heated our home. And my dad would say, well, let's pick any two because that's what we can do this month. So, you don't have to be the world's most sensitive kid to realize that financial pressures were genuine and real and grinding. I could not get a straight answer from my brother about where was my toy box. My father came home. He was out looking for work. He came back later in the day. He'd gone to the grocery store to buy some food and was going to make dinner because my mom had already left for the all-night pharmacy where she worked. And I said, Brian, my brother, says, Dad, I said, Dad, Brian says, you know where the toy box is. And he said, yeah, I gave it to Monsieur Lacroix upstairs. We were in a triplex. in Lower Outremont in Montreal, Monsieur Lacroix upstairs, and I said, that was my toy box. And he said, well, Mr. Lacroix was out of money and didn't have any money for Saco. Saco was the oil company that delivered the oil to your house. But I had to get the furnace going in some way, shape, or form to have some heat because they've got 4 kids up there. And he asked me for money, and I didn't have any money. But this old mahogany toy box of yours would probably burn for a few days until he had the money to pay for the fuel. And I thought that the least we could do is give him the toy box. Now, I want to be perfectly clear with everybody in this hall. I didn't have the least charitable instinct about that toy box. That was my toy box. And I didn't engage at the broader level of reaching out to people who are doing perhaps worse than you are. But I was angry. I was deeply angry. And I was so angry that I skipped dinner. Trust me. For me to skip a meal, you're dealing with serious anger. And went to bed and cried a little bit. And, you know, I was a kid. And my mother would normally come home from the all-night drugstore, wake me up about 6:30 or 7, make sure I got on my way, got a shower, cleaned up, had a bit of breakfast, etc. Put on my leggings. It was a Montreal winter, so, you know, and your boots, etc. Vulcanized rubber boots, etc. And then she would walk me to the bus on Bernard and DeLippe, which I would take down to my school on the corner of Mount Royal and Park Avenue. And she said, I heard from Dad you didn't have any supper last night. And I said, no. She says, well, the cold version of that supper are the sandwiches in your lunchbox, and make sure you eat the celery and the sandwiches before you eat the Dare cookies, etc. So, got it. And she said, why didn't you have supper last night? And I said I was angry. And she said, oh. Then she did something which is always a sign of trouble. Hugh David Segal. When your mother uses all 3 names, this is deep doo-doo. And she said, oh, you were angry. Why were you angry? He gave away my toy box to Monsieur Lacroix, and I don't have a toy box. Well, he said he would buy you one when he got a job. Yeah, right, I said. Why are you angry that Dad gave that wood so that the family upstairs could be warm for a few days before they had money for the oil? And I said, Mom, that was my toy box, and I think it's unfair. Well, then she did the worst thing. My son, hands on hips, when you're in hands on hips, you're into a very dangerous territory. And she said, Mr. Lacroix didn't have enough money to pay for the fuel oil to keep his apartment warm. He has little kids. He asked your dad for some money, and your dad didn't have any money. And he gave him the toy box to keep him warm. And you have the temerity to be angry? I am ashamed of you. I cried all the way to school. And I didn't cry all the way to school because I realized I was wrong. I cried all the way to school because I thought she was wrong. And I didn't, it was my toy box. Why would I be in trouble because they gave away it didn't make any sense at all that day. But then a few days later, I thought about it. It was clear that I was being selfish and that there were people in Montreal, certainly, who were in worse economic shape than we were, and that's always the case. And the notion that you would not understand that, perhaps at 8, is understandable, but it's not clear to me why you would not understand that if you were, for example, the Premier of Ontario. And that was one of those events where I began to realize that there was something bigger in life than what your own personal interests were.
Indeed. And to stay on childhood just for a moment, as an elementary school kid, you'd lost your father at 14, tragically. He was a cab driver. I think your grandfather was a CCF organizer.
I'm afraid so.
And the Conservative Prime Minister of Canada comes to speak to your elementary school.
Yeah, Mr. Diefenbaker came in 1962, so that was the election that Mr. Diefenbaker won, but only with a minority. And he didn't get formally replaced by Mr. Pearson until 1963. And he came to our school during the election campaign, and all the community swells were out, as you can imagine. And he did have some of the local candidates with him, but his main purpose in coming was to present a copy of the Canadian Bill of Rights, which had passed Parliament under his government in 1960, to the principal of my school, to hang up in the school, etc. And he made a fascinating speech in which he made no reference to partisanship at all. He didn't say anything about his party or why one might vote this way or the other. He merely said, "The Canada I believe in is one where the family table has room for everybody. Whether they are immigrants or whether they are farmers or whether they are senior citizens or whether they have a handicap or whether they are this color or this religion or that, there's got to be room at the family table for everybody because we have the wealth as a country to do that." And then he looked at all of us, and of course our parents were there because the Prime Minister had come, and so the place was full. And he said, "I need your help to make sure there's room for everybody at the family table. I don't care how you vote, and I don't care what your politics are, but I want you to join with me and others to make sure that family table has room for everybody. And we never get to the point where there's no room for people who need to be there." And I was swept away by that. And it was the first time I began to think of life as something other than where's my toy box, or whether I was going to get to play hockey that week, or whether we could afford to get the hockey equipment necessary for that to happen. I began to think about life in terms of what we all have a duty to do to make that family table available to everybody. Make sure there's room at it. Make sure there's an opportunity for people to come to that family table, because that's one of the central and core ideas of Canada. And when I got home, of course, my father, who was a cab driver by then, and he was a volunteer in the Liberal Riding Association of Montreal-Cartier, working for Milty Klein, the MP in the area. And my grandfather was an organizer for the International Ladies Garment Workers Union, working in a clothing factory, a women's clothing factory in downtown Montreal. And of course, you know, my grandfather's line was, when I said I was really impressed with Mr. Diefenbaker and I thought I might volunteer for his local candidate in the riding of Mount Royal, by the way, one of the safest Liberal ridings in the history of civilization. It was Alan J. McNaughton, the Speaker of the House, who was in it then, and then of course it was taken up as a gift from Mr. Pearson to bring Mr. Trudeau into national politics, the father, and remained a Liberal Rottenborough in perpetuity. And my father did as only fathers can. He dropped his fork and knife and said, "Over my dead body." And my grandfather said, "You're going to go work for the boss's party?" And I said to him, "Zeta, the bosses who own the clothing factories against which you have to run a strike to get fairness for the workers so they can have a lunch break or a washroom on the same floor, or get reasonably paid on a salaried basis and not piecework, you get paid for how many pieces of work you actually get done, they're all liberals." Because the Montreal establishment was liberal, and I could say that knowing full well. So that, you know, I don't have to be part of that crowd. And then when my father said, you can't work for the Conservatives, I knew I was onto something. And being, as my daughter would say, one of the nerdiest kids in the history of mankind, you know, some kids in their early teens are into music, rock and roll, God knows what else. I was into conservative politics because it struck me as the right place to be in support of the cause. However naive I might have been at the time.
To which your mom said?
My mom said, she was wondering, she said, her name was Sadie, and she said, "Look, we're not going to have a fight at the Friday night table, all right? You're going to write a letter tomorrow to each one of the party leaders." So Mr. Diefenbaker, who was the Prime Minister, Mr. Pearson was the leader of the Liberal Party of Canada, Robert Thompson was the leader of the Social Credit Party of Canada, and Tommy Douglas was leader of the New Democratic Party of Canada. You're going to write them and ask them, why should a young person like yourself join their party, and see why and what they write back. And then you'll make a rational decision and we'll discuss it. So of course I wrote those letters the next morning, right? I was a total nerd and mailed them off. And within about 10 days, I got pamphlets. Mimeographed, there's a word from the past, a mimeographed letter with a pamphlet from Mr. Pearson and from Mr. Thompson and Mr. Douglas and Réal Coët. Don't forget Réal Coët, the créditiste de Québec. And then I actually got a personal letter. At least it appeared to be personal. It said, "Dear Hugh," and there was 4 or 5 paragraphs, and then a series of speeches added to it. And it was signed John Diefenbaker, stationary, the Prime Minister of Canada. And interestingly enough, historically one might say, well, should he have been writing letters to kids or should he have been dealing with his other problems, which were quite compelling at the time, as you may recall. Mr. Coyne and all that good stuff, and the difficulties with the divided cabinet over the Cuban Missile Crisis and all that. But here was this letter, and I, of course, smudged the last part of the signature to make sure it was real, and it appeared to be real. And he had said, Dear Mr. Segal, dear Hugh, we would love for you to join the Progressive Conservative Party. I made a distinction in the Spectator this morning between the Progressive Conservative Party and the small-minded Conservative Party. Don't know whether that's going to be a new organization, the small-minded Conservative Party. Perhaps based at Queen's Park. I don't know whether that's their plan. Then he said, I've included some speeches where I talk about some of the issues which I think are important for young people in Canada today, and I hope you get a chance to read them. Well, I was done like dinner. I had a letter from the Prime Minister. He had sent me speeches where he had talked about opportunity and education and fairness and all that stuff. So I became emotionally committed to Mr. Diefenbaker and the Progressive Conservative Party long before I understood what the party was about, which is often what happens. And then, of course, because the community in which I lived was largely liberal, let me tell you how liberal it was. The candidate in our riding was a young man by the name of the Conservative candidate, Stan Schenkman. Came from a family of developers and business people, lovely young guy. And he had a committee room on DeCarry Boulevard. And one Sunday, we had one of these little kind of ice cream trucks. And the slogan was, Stan the man Schenkman, your man for Mount Royal, whatever. But it was giving out free kosher hot dogs with free drinks, right? In a park that was in the center of the Jewish part of the community. And guess what? Not one single kid approached the truck. Because it was a conservative truck. You couldn't eat from a conservative truck. God knows where that would lead. Could lead to dancing. God knows. So
Let's fast forward, because you're an undergraduate at the University of Ottawa.
yes.
You run for student politics, and tell us how you find your way at Queen's Park.
Well, it was a series of accidents. Alan Rock had run and been elected as president of the student government of the University of Ottawa. He was a law student, an active liberal then and now and in between. I ran as the vice president, quote, academic. There was a vice president admin and vice president academic, and I got elected. And when we took over, so to speak, we were in dispute with the Ontario Union of Students, OUS they were called, and we had determined that they were a little too left-wing. They were spending the money we sent them on things like supporting Castro and taking a strong position on the Vietnam War and having a strong view on Cambodia and all that stuff, which was understandable and respectable. We thought they should be spending the money on students, generating benefits for students like insurance or subsidized trips or study tours or things that would be of value to the university students whose money it was. So we withdrew. And the OUS was in some kind of conflict with the government of Ontario of the day and withdrew all their involvement in any consultative committees that went on at Queen's Park, where university students were there as delegates, if you wish, of the university bodies in the province. So the Minister of Colleges and University, a young, chubby MPP from Brampton by that Peel it was called back then. William Grenville Davis was the Minister of Colleges and Universities. And they had the OSAP Advisory Committee, so the Ontario Student Awards Program, which is the financial support program for students who have financial need, had an advisory committee. It had professors, it had students, it had university administrators to give the government of the day some advice and counsel. And because there were no university students who would go on, they called the University of Ottawa, because we were the only student union outside the OUS. And they asked Alan if he would want to go on, and Alan was interested in federal politics and didn't care much for provincial politics, so he said, well, you're a Tory, you should go. And at the age of 20, now think about this, think about the toy box and all the rest. I got to fly to Toronto, stay at the Lord Simcoe Hotel, which no longer exists, and we'd work all day on this committee. And they would serve us lunch, and the Premier of the province, then the Minister of Colleges and Universities, would come on in to discuss what we had been doing all day with us on a regular basis. So that's how I got to meet him and see him, and I was blown away by the granular understanding of how the post-secondary system worked, and more importantly, his granular engagement with how unfair it was for people of difficult financial circumstances not to get a chance to participate in that and get the benefits of that. And that started a relationship which went on for years, and when he finally ran for leader to succeed Mr. Robarts in 1970, while our part of Eastern Ontario, Ottawa, was largely for a gentleman by the name of Bert Lawrence, a lovely man who was Minister of Health and MPP for Ottawa-Carleton. I was youth for Davis, and that became the beginning of a long relationship.
And as part of that relationship, first of all, I want you to touch on two things that crystallized your thinking about guaranteed annual income, basic income. One was something called the Niagara Conference, which is a federal thinkers conference to think about the future of conservative politics in Canada. Touch on that. And then, when you were working for Mr. Davis, there was a file related to seniors in poverty in this province. Talk to the audience about both of those things.
So, in 1968, the Americans elected a chap by the name of Richard Milhouse Nixon to be President of the United States.
How'd that turn out?
Yeah. And none of us would think of him as a raving socialist or however, he had campaigned on a platform of law and order. And when he got into the White House and got briefed, and he appeared to be someone who took the briefing seriously, not all presidents do, but apparently he did, he was told that in the inner cities in the United States, the core problem with respect to law and order were families where the father had left, where there was no financial capacity to survive, the kids had no parental influence, they all got into trouble, and the only way you could fix that is by having a family benefits program that operated automatically to help keep those families together. By the way, the young whippersnappers in the White House working with him on this had names like, I'm sorry?
Daniel Patrick Moynihan.
Daniel Patrick Moynihan, a guy called Dick Cheney, and
Rumsfeld.
another fellow who was in charge of the little policy unit called Rumsfeld, if you can imagine.
Yeah.
And so this plan was developed by Nixon. There was quite a bit of discussion. It was in the media. And now, you know, being the United States, it didn't quite get through the Congress. But it was something that was talked about a lot. So, of course, because there's a contagion effect, there was then discussion in federal conservative circles about that kind of basic income fundamental approach. And David MacDonald, who I had the chance of working with, who was a United Church minister, elected as the Progressive Conservative MP from Prince Edward Island, the riding of Egmont, which is sort of West Prince, Summerside west to Tignish. He did a working paper on what a basic income would look like and why it would be an improvement in terms of how we do welfare now. And got me invited to a Priorities for Tomorrow policy conference, Niagara Falls, in the fall of 1969. And there's a wonderful speech which Mr. Stanfield gave to the Empire Club about 6 weeks before that meeting, which I cite in the book, where he talks about I've taken a lot of heat because I'm open to the discussion of this idea, and people are thinking that I want to give away money for no good purpose or to people who don't deserve it. And some may think I'm a dangerous left-winger. Well, I hope they don't think I'm as much of a communist as the person who's now occupying the White House, Richard Milhous Nixon. And it went to that conference, and there was a robust debate. Some of you will remember Jack Horner, who was the MP from Crowfoot, a very articulate and authentic individual, and he went to the microphone and said, "I've read this paper, and it is communism," which was a nice opening way to have a constructive, collective discussion. And so what Mr. Stanfield did was he appointed the Honourable Jean Wads, who was an MP from Prescott, Ontario, to chair a committee that would kind of try to do the classic homogenization of different points of view so that everybody still talked to each other at the end of the meeting. And the newspapers caught it, and the newspapers wrote pieces about how the Tories avoided dealing with the basic income just to keep unity in the party. But having been there and having seen the debate and the discussion, it struck me that the proposal was substantial. It was meaningful. It was about reducing the stigma in terms of how we try to reduce poverty. It was about giving people choices in their life. And I became very, very impressed with the importance of that idea going forward. So a few years later, I'm working for Mr. Stanfield. I'm his legislative secretary. Mr. Diefenbaker, Mr. Davis.
Yes.
And I'm his legislative secretary. It's after 75, and there's been a minority government elected. Stephen Lewis is the leader of the New Democratic Party, and Bob Nixon from Brant is the leader of the Liberal Party. There'd been a shift. Stephen became the leader of the opposition, and the Liberals went down to third place. As a young legislative assistant, I was doing my business, trying to make sure there were no surprises in the legislature. And in comes one morning the deputy minister for the social policy field, Douglas Wright, a very decent individual who went on to become president of the University of Waterloo, very bright, to share with me that in the committee hearings that morning, the NDP had made a motion supported by the Liberals to reduce his salary as deputy minister to $1 and the minister's salary to $1 because they weren't dealing with the issue of seniors' poverty. Now, we had just gone through an election campaign. Rent control was an issue. Healthcare was an issue, but the issue of seniors' poverty had never come up in the campaign, not in the debates, not in any of the... So I said to Doug, well, first of all, the committee report has to be approved by the legislature before it has any effect. So, don't sell the house and the car yet. I think you'll be all right for a while. But why don't we find out what they're talking about? What is the issue? What is the information that they are basing their resolution upon? So that study was done, and it produced a remarkable piece of work done by Treasury, Economics, and Intergovernmental Affairs. It was TIGA, it was called TEIGA. And the minister was the Honourable W. Darcy McHugh, MPP for Chatham, Ontario, known as the Duke of Chatham. And, he was a solid conservative, rock-ribbed, a little bit to the right, not unreasonable, but a little bit to the right. And I was convinced that when that report went to cabinet, you'd have the usual suspects, the McMurtrays and the Grossmans and the Wells on one side and the other folks on the other side, and nothing would happen. It would be a repeat of what happened at the Niagara Conference. And Mr. Davis would always canvass the table. The way his approach to cabinet decision-making was you canvass the table, hear what everybody says, and then you describe the consensus, which he would do as premier, and that would then become the minute from the meeting. And if any minister wanted to disagree with the minute, well, that was a whole other thing, so to speak. Anyway, so as we're going around the table, it gets to Darcy. And I'm part of the hired help with my back against the wall, listening to the discussion. And Darcy says, the vast majority of people over 65 are women. The men didn't live that long back then. They're the women who got us through the Depression, and they're the women who waited for the boys to come home from war. and they are not going to be poor in by Ontario, period, full stop. And 6 weeks later, a piece of legislation was brought in called the Guaranteed Annual Income Supplement, GAINS, GAINS it was called. Every program always had some sort of epithet of that kind. Home ownership was the Home Ownership Made Easy program called HOME, right? So GAINS. And it passed unanimously because all the parties were in favor of it, obviously. And that produced an automatic system. Didn't have to file out any forms or go see a welfare officer or plead your case. You filed your taxes, as we're all supposed to do every year. You fell beneath a certain line, you would be topped up. And that reduced the level of poverty amongst women and older people in this province over the age of 65 from 35% to 3% in 3 years. So the notion that we don't know how to do it, and then of course it spread to some other provinces, and then the federal government took it over, and it's the Guaranteed Income Supplement now, which assures every Canadian over the age of 65 of a basic income amount every year. So that was one of the things which said to me, so we can do that justifiably for our seniors who deserve it. We are now doing important things for kids in terms of the child benefit, which is truly helpful, and I give Mr. Trudeau and his government full credit for that, period, full stop. But for the 18 to 64 aged people who fall into poverty and difficulty for a whole bunch of reasons that are often beyond their control, never happened. But low-income people in Canada die sooner, and they live more difficult lives. And we have the ability to deal with that by dealing with the abatement of poverty in a much more civilized, responsible, efficient, and humane way. And those two reports address that as directly as they could.
And as you and I discussed earlier today, the fabulous work by the Hamilton Spectator on Code Red that identified a 21 or 22-year life expectancy gap between rich and poor neighborhood based on postal code, extraordinary differences in educational outcomes.
And what we know in terms of the social determinants of health,
Indeed.
in which there's been a lot of research done by the medical profession and by others. There's a book by Dr. Martin called Better Now, where she is a physician and she's a director of research at the Women's College Hospital in Toronto and has a robust downtown practice, and she talks about the impact of poverty on her patients and how when she has to give a prescription for a drug or something else, she'd rather say, live in a better house, get fresh food, do some exercise, because those will actually be better long haul for that person's health than the prescription she has to give because there's no other options available at that particular point in the cycle.